in your book, Latin America from Colonization to Globalization, you called the United States a leading terrorist state, a gangster state. Can you talk about this and the U.S.'s double standard on terrorism in the hemisphere? And also, who is Luis Posada Carriles and Orlando Bosch?
Bosch is an interesting case. He is a leading terrorist. The Department of Justice and the FBI wanted him deported. They described him as a threat to American security. I think they charged him with about 30 significant terrorist acts. The government was then George W. Bush #1, George H.W. Bush. They overruled the Justice Department and the FBI and gave him free rein in Florida, where he's now joined by his friend Posada Carriles, another major terrorist. He's being tried, but not for terrorism, just for some lying on his passport or something like that. Look, I mean, these are terrorists for us, so they're not terrorists. In fact, it's kind of striking because there is Bush #2 had a Bush doctrine, which was widely publicized, which said that those who harbor terrorists are as guilty as the terrorists themselves. Well, here are two of many terrorists that we're harboring, but the press can't talk about that. In fact, the worst terrorists are the ones in the government. So you take the war on terror was not declared by George W. Bush. It was declared by Ronald Reagan. When he came into office, his administration said straight off that the main focus of U.S. policy is going to be state-directed international terrorism, the plague of the modern age, and on and on. And right at that time, I started writing about terrorism. And what I did was considered outrageous. I took the official definition. You take the official definition of terrorism in the U.S. Code and in Army manuals and the British government definition, they're all about the same. And you look at it, and you have to conclude right away that the U.S. is the world's leading terrorist state. I mean, Cuba is one example. There was massive terror in Cuba, starting right after the Bay of Pigs invasion. Kennedy authorized terrorist operations, which were pretty serious. They were under the direction of his brother, Robert Kennedy, and his official biographer, Arthur Schlesinger, says that Kennedy's prime responsibility was to bring the terrors of the earth to Cuba. That's straight out of the official stuff. There isn't much talk about it, but a lot of documents are out, and it was pretty serious terrorism. A lot of killing, sinking ships in the harbor, shelling, blowing up petrochemical installations, killing a lot of people. In fact, there was an invasion planned for October 1962, the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it's quite possible, we don't have Russian archives, that the Russians and the Cubans were responding to the threat of an invasion. Of course, they knew about it, even if it's not reported here. Actually, the first book just appeared by a Canadian researcher of oral history of victims of the terror. We don't talk about our victims, but a book did appear by Keith Bellender taking oral histories of the victims from the early 60s. And then it went on. In the late 70s, the Bosch-Carriles major terrorist act was the shooting down of a Cubana airliner in 1976, I think, killing, I forget how many, 70 people, or a lot of people, and a significant terrorist act. And there were embassies blown up, all kinds of things happening. That was the late 70s. Cuba was rewarded for that. They were placed on the terrorist list by Reagan. There is a terrorist list, and in 1982, Cuba was placed on it, perhaps as a reward for having been the world's leading victim of terrorism. And that was kind of interesting. The reason they were placed on it is because there was a gap. The gap was that Saddam Hussein was removed. So they removed Saddam Hussein because they wanted to arm and support him, their friend Saddam. That went on. Okay. That's incidentally what the terrorist list is like, you know. And it continues. And in the 1980s, there isn't even anything to discuss. I mean, the United States was condemned by the International Court of Justice for unlawful use of force, means terrorism, in its war against Nicaragua. And that was a very interesting case. The case was presented by a well-known international lawyer from Harvard University, background in government and so on. But most of his case was thrown out by the World Court. And the reason is, an interesting reason, when the United States agreed to World Court jurisdiction in 1946, it added a reservation, namely that the U.S. cannot be brought to the court on violation of any international treaty. That means the U.S. is free to violate the UN Charter, the Charter of the Organization of American States, any other international treaty. That's our right, you know. So that part of the case had to be thrown out. They couldn't be charged with aggression or whatever. And the case was restricted to a very narrow U.S.-Nicaragua bilateral treaty. But even on those grounds, the Reagan administration was condemned for unlawful use of force, ordered to terminate it, and pay quite substantial reparations. Well, how'd the U.S. react? The media reacted by dismissing the court as a hostile forum. That's the way the New York Times editors put it, which is true. They ruled against the United States, so therefore not worth considering. Congress reacted by increasing the funding of the Contras, bipartisan Congress, incidentally. Nicaragua brought the case to the Security Council, the UN Security Council, which did, in fact, tried to pass a resolution calling on all states to observe international law. U.S. vetoed it. France and Britain politely abstained. It happened twice, in fact. All of this is out of history. It's as if it didn't happen. If you did a poll in Harvard University Department of International Relations, nobody would know what you're talking about. It's just out of history. When we commit terror, it didn't happen. And it goes on. These are only the two most blatant cases. There are plenty of others. So take, say, the Middle East. In 1985, there's a poll of editors every year that asks them, what's the most important story of the year? The most important story of the year was Middle East terrorism in 1985. That's a good story. The worst act of terrorism in the Middle East in 1985 was in Lebanon. There was a truck bombing outside a mosque, timed to go off when people left the mosque. It was aimed at a Shiite cleric, but they missed him. They killed about 80 people, mostly girls and women, big bombing. That's by far the worst terrorist act in the Middle East. Not mentioned, good reason. It was run by the CIA. It was run by the CIA with the help of British and Saudi intelligence, so that's off the record. And it's just consistent. I can't even call it a double standard. It's a single standard. If we commit crimes, they didn't exist. If somebody else does, we raise our hands in horror. It's uniform.
Can you talk a bit about the Cuban embargo, what the Cubans call the blockade of Cuba, its significance, and why does the United States continue to enforce this embargo on Cuba when it meets with the rest of the world and even its former enemies?
See, it's for about 40 years now, ever since there have been polls, a considerable majority of Americans want to normalize relations with Cuba. Okay, it's normal for the government to disregard popular opinion, so that's not surprising. What's more interesting in this case is that substantial segments of the American business community want to normalize relations. The energy corporations, pharmaceutical corporations, agribusiness, they're pretty substantial sectors. They usually determine foreign policy. But in this case, the state is overruling even the concentrations of private power, which is quite unusual. And that's because there's a real state interest involved. Cuba carried out successful defiance of U.S. policy, and you don't permit that. It's what I sometimes call the mafia doctrine. International affairs is very much like the mafia. Take, say, The Godfather. If some small storekeeper doesn't pay protection money, it's not going to mean anything to The Godfather, but he doesn't let it go. He sends in his goons, not just to get the money, but to beat the guy to a pulp, because others have to understand you don't disobey The Godfather. And that's a major principle of international affairs. If somebody can get away with something, somebody else will try. So no matter how small they are, they're a real danger. Like when Grenada started fishing cooperatives, Carter came down like a ton of bricks. That had to be stopped. Finally, they invaded and took care of it. And in fact, the smaller the country is, the worse the threat. Because if even a tiny place can get away with something, a bigger place will try. In fact, there's a name for it. You take a look at the internal documents in the United States and Britain, it's the same. They're constantly talking about the virus of nationalism. And it's a virus because it can spread. If somebody gets away with independence, somebody else is going to try. So you got to stamp out the virus and prevent contagion. And it's done all the time. Like, take, say, Vietnam. The concern about Vietnam, we read from the internal documents in the very early 1950s, is that there could be a course of successful independent nationalism, which would influence others in the region to try the same thing. So you have to kill the virus and stop the contagion, and the way you do it is by destroying the virus. So South Vietnam totally wiped out, and install military dictatorships everywhere else. Philippines, Thailand, everywhere. Like Indonesia. So you stop the spread, and it's the same with Cuba. We have the internal documents, very explicit. Kennedy, for example, when he came in, had a Latin America advisory team, for what it was called, headed by Arthur Schlesinger, historian. And they provided their analysis of the Cuba problem to him. And what they said is the threat is what they called the spread of the Castro idea of taking matters into your own hands. That's dangerous. That's a virus. And Schlesinger added, it could appeal to others in the region who are suffering from similar conditions. They may try to do the same thing. And pretty soon the whole system's unraveling. That's the mafia. And that's such a strong overriding consideration that Cuba you have to continue punishing the Cubans, even overruling major economic sectors in the United States. It's not the only case. Iran's pretty similar. Like U.S. energy corporations would be delighted to go into Iran and exploit its oil resources. They don't want China to do it. But there's a state interest. Iran was defiant, and they got to be punished, no matter what anybody's interest is. These are interesting cases in international affairs because, typically policy just reflects economic and strategic interests. But there are some cases where it doesn't, and those cases are particularly striking. Cuba's a case in point.